Hi, Eastlake teachers. This is Ren Yu, the Director of Education, Research, and Engagement, and I'm here to share with you school readiness outcomes for the current school year of 21-22. We are going to look at our fall and winter TSG data together. Let's begin by talking about how child outcomes are determined. We determine child outcomes by participating in the child progress monitoring process. This is the process by which you, as teachers, observe children. You document what they can do by what you see and hear. This might look like anecdotal notes, it might look like photos, videos, or work samples, and then you upload them to a system, either Teaching Strategies Gold or Work Sampling Online. We know for Eastlake, everybody uses Teaching Strategies Gold, and it's just basically a website, a database that allows us to create an ongoing portfolio that shows how the children in our classrooms have grown over the year. When we participate in child progress monitoring, we're using the child progress monitoring cycle. So this looks like beginning with observing and collecting facts. You observe the children in your classroom, you take anecdotal notes, you take photos, you take videos, or you take photos or scan work samples. And then you're going to analyze and respond to this evidence. So you need to look at it and determine, is this quality evidence? Does this tell me what a child in my classroom can do? If that is the case, then we need to do a little bit more analysis and response. You need to determine which children this piece of evidence is linked to, as well as which objectives this piece of evidence is linked to. And then we move on to evaluation. So that might look like actually implementing your checkpoints, but it's not necessarily even just used for checkpoints. You evaluate every time you upload a piece of evidence to TSG because you place that piece of evidence on the preliminary level for that child. So that gives us a little bit of pre-evaluation before we do our checkpoints, and that's why it's a best practice. So once we've analyzed and responded, once we've evaluated this piece of evidence, then we're going to summarize, plan, and communicate. So that looks like using the information that you take from TSG, using this data that you have about your children to plan lessons. You might look and see, where do children need more support? Can I look at those objectives where my children are a little bit low? Can I look at the continuum of learning for the year? Perhaps there are some things that we have not gotten to yet. Also, I can plan for small group activities, but I can also plan which children are going to be in my small groups depending on what their data looks like. And we use this to communicate as well. You might communicate with your director or your instructional support coach and let them know that you need some support for a specific child or in a specific domain. You will also communicate with families and share this information with them to let them know how their children are doing in the program, how they will continue to grow, and how parents can support at home. So know that this cycle isn't always perfect. Sometimes we might communicate about a piece of evidence prior to uploading it. We might use it a little bit to plan, but generally this is the path that we're going to follow when we're participating in child progress monitoring. It's also important for us to understand what are the goals of our agency as we're looking at our own data for our site. So I know at Eastlake you don't have any pre-K classrooms, so we don't need to look at the pre-K goals, but let's look at preschool, infant, toddler, and agency-wide. So for preschoolers, and this information is actually pulled from our data from the 2021 school year. So over the summer, we do a deep dive into data and we really look at the areas where our children need some more support in the coming year. And so this is all pulled from our school readiness plan, and that school readiness plan is based on the previous year's data. So for preschool, we want children to comprehend language, to speak clearly, to engage in conversation, and to notice and discriminate rhyme. Then for our infants and toddlers, we want them to also engage in conversation and use social rules of language. And if you'll notice, even in the pre-K goals, I've highlighted conversation because that's something that came up in all of our goals. And I just really thought that that nicely highlighted the importance of conversation in our programming and just in our day in general. We really need to be mindful that we're engaging in a lot of conversation with the children we serve. And then agency wide, we would like to see progress in language literacy, STEAM, and social emotional domains. So that's pretty much all of our domains. There's no specific number goal, there's no specific percentage there, but what we want to see is that the children who are coming into our program and spending a year with us are growing and learning throughout, and they're growing and learning in multiple different ways across many different domains. We'll begin diving into our data by looking at our overview. So this shows us all of the domains where we assess children in TSG. You'll see that fall is represented in pink, winter is represented in teal. So looking at social, emotional, physical, language, cognitive literacy, and mathematics domains, you'll notice something that's the same in every domain. When I look at your data from fall to winter, I'm noticing consistent gains from fall to winter. So that looks excellent. That's what we expect to see. We want children to have a baseline in the fall, and we want to see some growth there for winter. And so we've seen that across the board with Eastlake. Now let's get into our language and literacy objectives. You'll notice that the color coding is the same as the last slide. Fall is represented in pink, winter is represented in teal. And you can see here all the individual language objectives that we see in TSG when we look at comprehends language, follows directions, uses an expanding expressive vocabulary, speaks clearly. Your children have grown from fall to winter in all of those areas. Your children have grown and uses conventional grammar, tells about another time or place. We do see in 10A engages in conversations a little bit of a fallback. You'll notice that the bar, the pink bar for fall, goes up to 90, and our bar for winter, the teal one, doesn't quite reach. And so it looks like we've had a little bit of a backslide on this. And that's not atypical. So that can be for a lot of different reasons. And you would have to tell me what those reasons are because y'all are the experts on your classrooms. But that might be because there's been an influx of new students. So you kind of are, your data from the fall is now in the winter reflecting some different kids who are in your classroom. It might be because some children are having poor attendance. If they're not coming to school frequently enough, then they're not getting what they need to stay at the pace that TSG has that children should ideally be learning at. It could also be because of COVID. Sometimes classroom shutdowns, children even, not even in a classroom being shut down, but just a child being sick or a child's family member being sick and being out for a while can have them pulled back a little bit like that. So there can be a lot of different reasons for it to look like that. It's really not a huge difference, so I'm not super concerned about it. But I will suggest that later on when we do an activity, y'all are going to look at the data from your classroom. You might want to look at that one specifically for your classroom. So we can kind of put a little check mark there to remind ourselves to look at that engages in conversations piece when we look at our individual classrooms. And then when we look at uses social rules of language, you can see that our bar for winter has far exceeded our bar for fall there. So take a moment, just review this data, kind of take it in and see if you feel like it lines up with what the children can do in your classroom. Because remember, this is your whole site. So it's going to look a little bit different classroom by classroom, but it's also very important for us to understand sort of what a holistic picture of our site looks like. Now let's look at our literacy outcomes. So we have 2 slides of literacy outcomes. This is the first. Again, we have our fall information represented in pink. We have winter represented in teal. So if we take a look here, the first thing that you might notice is that there are 3 objectives on this page that show that the children were at 100% in the fall and 100% in the winter. And sometimes that's a little bit concerning to people because 100% isn't always something that's attainable for us. You're not really going to see a lot of times 100% of children doing anything. So this can seem a little bit strange. But that's because these are particular objectives that for a lot of our children, a not yet for them is met. But also for our children, they may be taking some steps into these particular objectives that you wouldn't say, like for 16B identifies letter sound correspondences. Our children, we're not teaching them phonics yet, we're just teaching them letter identification. But for preschoolers, because they can't identify letters, they may be meeting that particular objective without actually being able to identify letter sound correspondences, because that's not developmentally appropriate for them. But what is developmentally appropriate is to name those letters so that later on they can gain that sound information and attach that sound to that letter name. So I hope that makes sense to you all. But when we look at the other objectives, when we look at notices and discriminates rhyme, notices and discriminates alliteration, identifies and names letters, uses and appreciates books and other texts, and uses print concepts, we see growth across the board. So that looks excellent. And of course, for those ones that are at 100%, that's really what we expect to see when we see when we look at TSG. So this looks wonderful. It looks like you've had some consistent growth in literacy concepts for the children that you serve. Now let's look at our second set of literacy outcomes. This is our last slide of objectives. And so you will notice here again, we have the same color coding. Fall is represented in pink, winter is represented in teal. Again, we have 3 objectives here that are at 100%. And that's because those are not developmentally appropriate for the children we serve. So for the children in your classroom, either they are not met on those objectives, or they're just starting to tiptoe into their little color bands, and where they are as far as using context clues, reading fluently, and writing using conventions is exactly where they are supposed to be for their ages and levels of development. But if you look at the rest of these objectives, you'll notice that you've had a great deal of growth from winter or from fall to winter. So when we look at children interacting during reading experiences, there's definitely a lot of growth there. Children using emergent reading skills, as well as children retelling stories and recounting details from informational texts. You had a lot of growth there, as well as children writing their names and writing to convey ideas and information. Now that you've been able to review your site-wide data, you have an assignment to work on. So what we looked at today was the data for every child at Eastlake. And that's very important for us all to understand and for us all to be able to wrap our brains around. But probably more relevant to you is the actual data for your classroom. And this is relevant because you use this to plan. You use this to make decisions about instruction every day. So the next step to this process is that you are going to pull a report from TSG about your class. From that report, you are going to select 2 objectives in language or literacy where the children in your classroom could use a little bit more support. And from there, you are going to create a document that highlights those 2 language or literacy objectives where your children need support, and you're going to come up with some ideas for how you can support children in your classroom. And those ideas can really range from very, very simple activities to much more involved activities. For example, if you are, seeing that your children really need to talk about another time or place, that's not something that's happening a lot in your classroom. You might just think about times where you can talk to the kids in the mornings and you can ask them questions about what they did the night before, ask them what happened on the weekend. You can have a closing circle every day where you talk about what happened that day and have conversations about what was your favorite thing that you did today, what did you eat for breakfast this morning, to really encourage those things to happen. So really just talking about some conversations you can have. Or you may want to be a little bit more analytical and academic with it. You might say that if children are struggling with identifying and naming letters, that you want to play some specific letter games like light up letters or letter bingo. You may also want to come up with some quick things that you can do in transition. So you could come up with some quick and easy alphabet transitions that you can do. But just really thinking about how you can look at your data, how you can analyze it, how you can tell by that data where the children are your class, where the children in your classroom are and what they need and how you can support them. So you will receive the information about how to complete that next step from Jasmine. Don't worry, you don't have to remember everything that I just said. Everything's written down. I've also included a guide that will walk you through how to pull a report from TSG. You certainly don't need to use that guide. If you pull reports from TSG and you have one that you prefer to use, please use the report that you would prefer to use. But if you do need some guidance on how to pull that report and kind of the best practices around that, that document will be very helpful for you. So like I said, I'll send that along to Jasmine. If you have any other questions or comments about data, certainly you are welcome to reach out to Letitia. You're welcome to reach out to Jasmine. But if you have any questions for me, you're welcome to email me at renY@ymcaatlanta.org. I appreciate your time so much. I really enjoyed sharing this data with you. And like I said, please reach out if you have any questions, concerns, or comments. Thank you so much for your time.